He had always liked quiet places. While most people found cemeteries unsettling, he found them peaceful. There was something about old graves that made him think about how short life really is, how quickly people's names can fade from memory. On weekends, he often walked through an old cemetery near the edge of town. It was small, surrounded by tall oak trees, and most of the graves were more than a century old. The stones leaned slightly, their names worn down by time and weather. That afternoon the air was still. The sky hung low with a soft gray color, and the only sounds were birds and the distant hum of the town. He had his camera with him, planning to take a few pictures for a small history project he had been doing. He liked to document forgotten places, old houses, broken fences, gravestones that no one seemed to visit anymore. It wasn't about fame or money. It was about preserving something before it disappeared completely. As he walked along a narrow path lined with dry leaves, something caught his eye at the far corner of the cemetery. There, hidden behind overgrown grass and a fallen tree branch, was a grave almost swallowed by the earth. The stone was cracked in the middle, covered in thick moss and dirt. From where he stood, he could barely read a single letter. He stepped closer, brushing away some leaves. The ground beneath his shoes was damp and uneven. He crouched and tried to clear the stone with his hand, but the moss clung stubbornly. He could make out faint lines, what looked like the curve of a name, but nothing more. For some reason, he felt a strange pull toward it. There were many graves around him, but this one felt different, like it had been waiting for someone to notice it. He took a closer photo, then stood there quietly for a moment. The air felt heavier there, not in a dark way, but in a way that carried history. Whoever rested there had probably been gone for more than 100 years. No flowers. No name visible. No trace of anyone who still remembered. He knelt again and carefully scraped away some more moss with a small stick. The surface beneath was smoother and a few faint letters appeared. He squinted, trying to read them. The first letter seemed to be E or maybe L. He couldn't tell for sure. He leaned back and sighed. It was almost impossible to read in that state. He took out his phone and searched for any digital record of the cemetery. There were some listings, mostly scanned from old burial books, but none matched the partial letters he had seen. It was like the person buried there had vanished from history completely. He stayed there longer than he planned. A cold breeze passed through, making the grass rustle. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang from the nearby church tower, signaling the hour. He finally stood up, brushing dirt from his jeans. Before leaving, he looked once more at the broken grave. The sunlight peeked through the trees for a second, falling directly onto it. The light made the moss shimmer faintly, and for a brief moment it looked less like a forgotten stone and more like a quiet memorial waiting to be found again. That evening, he couldn't stop thinking about it. At home, he sat by his desk, scrolling through old local records, cemetery logs, and scanned newspaper archives. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but something about that grave kept pulling at him. Maybe it was the mystery of it, or maybe it was the idea that someone once lived, loved, and died, and was now completely erased from memory. He found a few old maps of the cemetery. The section where that grave stood was marked as Lot 12, belonging to families who had lived in the town during the early 1900s. Most of those families had either moved away or had no surviving relatives. That explained the neglect. Still, there had to be a name, a story. He made a note in his notebook. Broken grave, far west corner, moss-covered, unreadable. Possibly female. Restore. He didn't know why he wrote restore. It just felt right. Over the next few days, he couldn't shake the thought. He found himself thinking about it while driving, while making coffee, even at work. It was as if that small, forgotten grave had imprinted itself in his mind. By Friday, he had made up his mind. He would go back on the weekend and clean it properly. Saturday came with light drizzle in the morning. He packed a small bucket, brushes, gloves, and a bottle of water. When he arrived at the cemetery, the air was cool and smelled of wet earth. He walked straight to the corner where he had found the grave. It looked just the same, silent and lost. He knelt and began to work, brushing away layers of moss with gentle strokes. It was slow work. The stone was fragile, and too much pressure could break it further. After a while, he switched to using an old toothbrush for the delicate spots. Gradually, the letters started to appear, faint but there. The first name came through after nearly an hour of cleaning. It was a woman's name, though still hard to read clearly. He whispered it softly, as if saying it aloud brought her back for a second. The rest of the inscription was still buried under grime and soil. As he continued, an elderly woman who was walking through the cemetery stopped nearby. She watched him for a moment and then asked what he was doing. He explained that he was restoring an old grave, just trying to make the name visible again. The woman smiled faintly and said, "That one's been like that for as long as I can remember. My grandmother used to talk about someone buried here, something sad, but I don't recall the story." Her words lingered in his mind. There was a story here, somewhere, something that had once mattered deeply but had been buried by time. He thanked the woman and kept working until the sun began to lower behind the trees. Finally, after hours of careful cleaning, he could read the whole inscription. The stone belonged to a young woman who had died in the early 1900s. The words "beloved daughter" were carved beneath her name. But there was no family name or date of birth, only the year she passed. He sat there in silence for a long time. The air had turned golden with the setting sun, and for a moment the grave didn't look lonely anymore. It looked peaceful, almost grateful. Before leaving, he took one last look at the bottom of the stone. That's when he noticed something strange. Near the base, carved faintly into the stone, were two small initials intertwined with a tiny heart shape. The carving looked different from the rest, less professional, more personal. Like someone had added it later, quietly, perhaps after the stone was placed. He traced his finger gently over the initials. They were old, yet still visible. Whoever had carved them must have cared deeply for the woman buried there. Maybe a lover, maybe a friend. The thought made his chest tighten. When he left that evening, he looked back once more. The sky was streaked with orange and pink, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the graves. The one he had cleaned stood out now, not perfect but visible again. He promised himself he'd come back next week to finish the restoration and maybe bring some flowers. That night he sat at his desk again, opening his laptop. He searched the woman's name and year of death, hoping for any trace. There were tiny fragments here and there, a mention in a century-old record, a brief note in an archived newspaper, but nothing that explained who she was or what happened to her. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the dim glow of his screen. It was strange how a single forgotten grave could make him feel so connected to someone he had never met. He didn't know her, didn't know her story, yet it felt deeply unfair that her name had almost vanished from history. He turned off the light and sat there in the quiet, thinking about how many lives have been lived, loved, and then forgotten. The grave was more than a stone. It was proof that someone once existed, someone who laughed, dreamed, and maybe waited for someone who never came back. He decided he would not let that grave fade again. The next morning he would return, not just to clean, but to uncover the story behind the woman whose name had waited 100 years to be seen again. The next morning he woke up earlier than usual. The thought of the old grave hadn't left his mind all night. He kept wondering who the young woman was and why her resting place had been forgotten for so long. It didn't feel right to just leave it half restored. He made himself a quick breakfast, packed a small lunch, and gathered what he needed: brushes, soft cloths, a bucket, and some gentle cleaning solution he had bought after reading online about how to clean old gravestones without damaging them. He even picked a small bunch of wildflowers from near his porch, just to place by the grave once it looked better. The road to the cemetery was quiet that Sunday morning. The sky was clear this time, with sunlight breaking through the trees. The cemetery was empty except for a few birds hopping along the paths. He liked it that way, peaceful, undisturbed. Just him and the whisper of the wind through the leaves. When he reached the grave, it looked almost the same as when he had left it, though the cleaned part seemed brighter, more visible now. The carved letters caught the sunlight gently, and the name looked clearer than before. He smiled a little and set down his tools. He started where he had stopped, carefully brushing away the dirt near the base of the stone. The initials and heart symbol he had noticed before were still there, faint but certain. He paused for a moment, thinking about who might have carved them. Maybe someone had stood in that same spot many years ago, missing her, grieving her, promising something they never got to keep. As he worked, a few people passed by, probably visiting their relatives' graves. One man stopped for a moment and asked, "You doing some kind of restoration?" He nodded and explained briefly what he was doing. The man smiled kindly and said, "That's good of you. Not many people care for the old ones anymore. Then he walked on, leaving the man alone again with his thoughts. After an hour, the stone looked almost new. It wasn't perfect, and time had left its marks, but it was readable now. The woman's full name stood out, followed by the words, "Beloved daughter." Beneath that, the year of death, 1911. Over 100 years ago. He sat down on the grass beside the grave to rest. The air smelled of earth and pine needles. He looked around at the other graves, many of them well kept with fresh flowers and polished stones. But this one had been abandoned for decades. He couldn't help wondering what had happened to her family. Why had no one come back? After a short break, he stood and cleared the area around the grave. Weeds had grown thickly, covering the small patch of ground. He pulled them out carefully, exposing the soil beneath. It took time, but when he was done, the area looked tidy, almost cared for again. He placed the wildflowers he'd brought in a small jar filled with water and set it by the stone. He stepped back and looked at the result. It was simple but beautiful. The grave finally looked like someone remembered her. Still, a question kept turning in his mind. Who was she? What had happened to her? Why did her grave have those carved initials at the bottom? He couldn't stop wondering. He took a photo of the cleaned grave and decided to visit the local library later that day. The library had a small section with town archives and old newspapers. Maybe if he was lucky, he could find her name there. That afternoon, he sat at one of the old wooden tables in the library. The place smelled like paper and dust. A kind librarian showed him where to look: old death registries, newspapers, and town records from the early 1900s. He went through them one by one, scanning pages filled with small, faded print. For the first hour, he found nothing. But then, in a stack of yellowed pages from a 1911 newspaper, he saw something that made him stop. It was a short obituary, barely 4 lines long. It mentioned the same name he had seen on the grave. It said she had passed away suddenly at the age of 23. There was no mention of family, no explanation of how or why. Just those few words. Gone too soon, beloved by all who knew her. He read the line several times. There was something deeply sad about how little was written. It was as if even in death her story had been cut short. He looked for more records but found almost nothing. No parents listed, no address, nothing about where she had worked or lived. It was strange. For someone whose grave said beloved daughter, there should have been family, some trace, some mention. But there was almost nothing left. As he flipped through another stack of old papers, he came across a small section with town gossip and notices. One short note mentioned a young woman who had worked at a local inn during that same year. It didn't give her name, but the timing and description matched. The note mentioned she was waiting for a letter that never came. He leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. Could that have been her? The thought of someone waiting endlessly for a letter that never arrived. It hit him harder than he expected. Maybe she had been in love with someone who went away and never returned. The carved initials at the base of the stone started to make more sense now. As the sun began to set outside the library windows, he packed his things, thanking the librarian. On the way home, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Her name, her age, the lonely words on her stone. It all painted a picture of someone who had lived a quiet, perhaps sorrowful life and then vanished into history. When he got home, he printed the old obituary and the note about the inn. He placed them in a small folder marked with her name. It wasn't much, but it felt like the start of something. He was determined to find out more. Over the next few days, he visited the old part of town where the inn once stood. The building was long gone, replaced by a modern cafe. But the owner said his grandfather used to talk about the old inn and the people who worked there. The man listened carefully as the owner recalled a few stories. There was a young woman who used to work here, the owner said. I don't know her name, but my grandfather said she was kind, always helping travelers. Then one day she just stopped coming to work. People said she got sick. Others said she was heartbroken. No one really knew. The man felt a shiver run down his spine. It had to be her. Everything matched. The time, the place, the sadness around her story. He thanked the cafe owner and walked back slowly through the old streets. The sun was low, painting the buildings in gold. He thought about the woman again. how she might have walked these same roads, maybe waiting for someone who never returned. That night, he sat at his desk, looking at the photo of her restored grave. The initials and the heart symbol seemed even more meaningful now. Someone had loved her. Someone had promised something, and that promise had never been fulfilled. Maybe that's why her story felt unfinished, why the grave had drawn him in. He closed his eyes and imagined her, not as a ghost or a mystery, but as a real person. A young woman with dreams standing by a window, holding a letter that never arrived. He felt a quiet ache in his chest. There was so much sadness in the idea of being forgotten. He opened his notebook and wrote down everything he had found so far. Name and year of death, the obituary with no details. Possible connection to an inn. Mention of waiting for a letter. Carved initials and heart at base of the grave. He looked at the list and underlined the last part. That was the clue. Whoever had carved those initials had been someone important to her. If he could find out who that person was, maybe the story would finally make sense. As the night deepened, he sat quietly, the only light coming from his desk lamp. Outside, the world was silent. Inside, his mind kept turning, piecing together a story that time had nearly erased. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to uncover something that would surprise him far more than he ever expected. The forgotten grave was about to reveal its secret, one that had waited more than a century to be found. The following week, he returned to the library again. The feeling of curiosity had turned into something deeper now, a quiet sense of responsibility. It no longer felt like just a project or a hobby. It felt personal, as if the young woman's story had chosen him to be told. He greeted the same librarian, who smiled when she saw him carrying the folder with her name written neatly on the cover. Still working on that mystery grave? She asked. He nodded and said softly, I think I'm getting close to understanding what happened to her. This time he asked to see any church records or birth registries that might match her name. The librarian led him to a locked cabinet filled with old handwritten books. The pages were fragile, the ink faded in places. He flipped through them carefully, scanning every line. After nearly an hour, he found it, her birth record. She was born right there in the same town in 1888. The record mentioned her parents' names and that they had owned a small bakery near the main square. He felt a small thrill of discovery, finally, a piece of her life before everything went wrong. He jotted down the address listed in the record, even though he knew the bakery probably didn't exist anymore. He wanted to see where she had lived. That afternoon, he drove to the old town square. It was quiet now, lined with a few small shops and cafes. The address from the record led him to a corner building that looked very old, though freshly painted. A small antique store now stood where the bakery once was. Inside, he met the shopkeeper, a kind man in his 60s. When he mentioned the old bakery, the shopkeeper's face lit up. Oh yes, he said. My grandfather used to talk about that place. It was run by a lovely family, but something happened to them. A tragedy, I think. I don't remember all the details, but I know they had a daughter who passed away young. The man listened carefully, feeling the pieces connect. Do you know what happened to the family? He asked. The shopkeeper shook his head slowly. I think the parents moved away after she died. They couldn't bear to stay here. The bakery closed soon after. My grandfather said people used to bring them food because they stopped going out for weeks after her passing. The man thanked him for sharing the memory and walked outside again. Standing for a while by the corner of the street, the image of the young woman's parents, heartbroken and leaving town after losing their only daughter, filled his mind. It added another layer of sadness to the story. No wonder no one had tended her grave for so long. That evening, back home, he spread out his notes on the table. He had her birth year, the year she died, her family's bakery, and the clue from the newspaper about her working at the inn. Now he needed to know what happened between those years, what could have led to her death at such a young age. He opened the town's online archives again, typing in her name and the year 1911. This time, he found a different document, a short mention in an old town report. It listed her as one of several people who had died under sudden and unclear circumstances. The report didn't give any details, only the date. He sat back thinking. That phrase, unclear circumstances, kept echoing in his head. It could have meant illness, an accident, or something else entirely. But the lack of detail made it even more mysterious. He spent hours cross-checking hospital records, but most from that time were incomplete. Then by chance he stumbled upon another small article from a newspaper published a few months after her death. It talked about a soldier who had returned to town after many years and left flowers at a grave in the old cemetery. The article didn't say whose grave it was, but it mentioned that he had carved something into the stone, a pair of initials joined with a heart. The man froze. His pulse quickened. Those were the same initials he had seen at the bottom of her grave. He read the paragraph again and again, making sure he wasn't imagining it. The timeline matched perfectly. The man in the article had come back after the war, probably too late, and left a mark for the woman he loved. It made sense now. The carved initials weren't random or decorative. They were a symbol of love that had outlived both of them. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the papers spread before him. For the first time, he felt like he could see the story forming clearly. A young woman who fell in love with a man who went away, maybe to war, maybe for work out, and promised to return. She waited, but he didn't come back in time. By the time he did, she was gone. Heartbroken, he left his mark on her grave, maybe hoping that one day someone would see it and remember. He imagined how that man must have felt, standing at the same grave he had now restored. The sorrow, the regret, the quiet goodbye carved into stone. He couldn't stop thinking about it. A few days later, he decided to visit the town museum. It was a small place, mostly run by volunteers, filled with old photos, tools, and letters from the town's past. When he explained what he was researching, the curator grew curious and offered to help. Together, they went through a stack of old photographs from the early 1900s. Many were faded, but one caught his eye, a black and white picture of the cemetery taken sometime in the 1920s. The graves looked much newer then, and there, near the corner of the photo, was the same stone he had cleaned. It looked bright, well cared for, with flowers all around it. He stared at the photo, amazed. "So someone did visit her," he said softly. The curator nodded. "Yes, for a few years after her death, that grave was often decorated. Then suddenly it stopped. We never knew why." He took a picture of the photo with his phone and thanked the curator. That night, he printed it out and placed it in the same folder as his notes. Looking at the photo made him feel strange. Not sad exactly, but humbled. He realized how easily a person's story can disappear unless someone chooses to remember. Over the next week, he went back to the cemetery several times. Each visit felt different. The first time it had felt like a mystery. Now it felt like visiting someone he knew, someone he wanted to honor. He cleaned the stone again gently, cleared the leaves that had fallen since his last visit, and replaced the wildflowers with fresh ones. Sometimes he would sit there quietly, thinking about how two people had loved each other. In a time when letters were their only connection, maybe she had waited by a window, watching the road, hoping to see him walk back home. And maybe he had carried her memory through battlefields, across oceans, only to find her gone when he returned. The love between them had outlasted everything, even time itself. He decided he wanted to know who the man with the initials was. If he could find a record of soldiers from that area around 1911 or shortly after, maybe one would match. He went back to the library again, checking war memorial records. There were only a few names that started with those same initials, both belonging to men who had enlisted during that time. He couldn't be sure which one it was, but one of them had a note beside his name. Missing, presumed dead, returned in 1913. That detail made his heart race. That had to be him. The soldier who came home too late. By now the story felt almost complete, yet there was something missing. A sense of closure. The man felt like there was still one final truth buried out there, waiting. One afternoon, as he stood by the grave again, a light breeze rustled through the trees. The sunlight filtered through the branches, and for a brief second, he thought he saw something glint near the base of the stone, a small metallic shimmer buried in the soil. He knelt down, brushing away the dirt with his fingers. It was just a corner of something, maybe a piece of old metal or a stone fragment. But when he tried to lift it, the soil gave way slightly. It looked like the ground had once been disturbed there a very long time ago. He stopped. He didn't want to dig too deeply without permission, but his heart was racing. What if there was something hidden there? something left behind intentionally. He stood up, looking down at the grave. The sun dipped lower, casting a warm golden light over the grass. He whispered quietly, "I'll be back." That night he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what he had seen, the faint glint, the softened ground, the possibility that something important was still there. He had already uncovered a story of love and loss, but something told him this wasn't the end. Somewhere beneath that soil, under the weight of time and silence, another piece of her story was waiting to be found, and he knew deep down that he wouldn't rest until he discovered it. He woke up the next morning with a restless feeling. The image of that faint glimmer near the grave wouldn't leave his mind. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It felt like the story itself was calling to him, asking to be finished. He knew he couldn't just ignore it. He packed his small tools again, the same ones he had used to clean the gravestone, along with a small brush and a pair of gloves. The sky was overcast, but the air felt calm. As he walked toward the cemetery, he noticed how familiar the path had become. The crunch of gravel under his shoes, the smell of pine trees, even the quiet hum of the wind. It all felt like part of a routine now. When he reached the grave, the grass around it had started to grow back slightly, but it still looked neat and cared for. He knelt down, brushing aside the thin layer of leaves that had fallen overnight. He could still see the faint outline of disturbed soil near the base of the stone where he had seen that shimmer before. He hesitated for a moment. He didn't want to disrespect the place, but something deep inside told him there was something important hidden there, something that was meant to be found. So he decided to be careful, gentle, and respectful. Using the small trowel, he began to scrape the soil lightly. The dirt was soft and crumbly. After a few minutes, he felt something solid beneath the surface. He brushed more soil away and saw the edge of a small rusted box. It was about the size of a book, covered in dirt, its metal edges corroded by time. His heart beat faster. He slowly lifted it from the ground. It was surprisingly light. For a moment, he just sat there staring at it. Whatever was inside had been buried there for more than 100 years. He didn't want to open it carelessly, so he placed it on his lap and took a few deep breaths before slowly lifting the lid. It creaked as it opened. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded cloth, was a folded letter. The paper was yellow and fragile, the ink faint but still readable. He could tell it was written with care. There was also a small pressed flower, brittle and pale, resting on top of it. He unfolded the letter slowly, afraid it might tear. The handwriting was beautiful, old-fashioned and written with emotion. The first line made him freeze. It began with, "My dearest one." He read on silently, his eyes moving across each word. The letter was from a man, and it was dated from the early 1900s, before the woman had died. The writer spoke about leaving for war, promising he would return soon. He apologized for not being able to say goodbye in person and asked her to wait for him. He wrote about dreams they had shared, about the life they planned together. He ended the letter with a promise that no matter how far he went, his heart would always belong to her. By the time he reached the last line, his hands were trembling slightly. The man had signed it with the same initials carved into the grave, the same ones he had seen at the bottom of the stone. He sat there in silence for a long time, the letter resting gently in his hands. Everything suddenly made sense. The carved heart, the initials, the empty look of the grave. It was all part of a story of love and loss. The soldier had written this letter before leaving, but for some reason, it had never reached her. Or maybe she had received it but never had the chance to respond before she passed away. He looked at the letter again, trying to imagine the moment it had been buried. Maybe the soldier had returned years later, found her gone, and buried this letter here himself. Maybe it was his way of saying goodbye. He carefully rewrapped the letter in the cloth, placing it back in the box. His eyes felt heavy, not from tiredness but from emotion. It was one thing to read about history, but another to hold it in his hands. This wasn't just a story, it was a piece of someone's life, someone's heart. He decided to take the box to the town museum the next day. It felt wrong to keep something so important hidden again. People deserved to know the story, to remember both of them. Before leaving the cemetery, he placed the box gently beside the grave, whispering softly, "I'll keep your story safe now." Then he stood quietly for a while, looking at the stone and the flowers swaying in the breeze. The grave didn't look forgotten anymore. It looked alive, with memory, with meaning. The next morning he walked to the museum carrying the box carefully wrapped in a cloth bag. The same curator greeted him at the door. When he explained what he had found, her eyes widened with disbelief. She led him to a quiet corner where they placed the box on a table and opened it together. When she saw the letter, she covered her mouth in surprise. "This is incredible," she whispered. "Do you realize how rare something like this is? This isn't just a personal note. It's a piece of our town's history." She read the letter silently, her eyes softening with each line. When she finished, she looked at him and said, "I think you were meant to find this." They agreed the letter should be preserved and displayed in the museum, along with the story of the woman and the soldier. The curator promised to create a small exhibit that would share their story with future generations. That evening, after leaving the museum, he returned to the cemetery once more. He brought a small lantern with him this time, lighting it as the sun began to fade. The glow of the lantern fell softly on the grave, casting warm light over the stone. He sat beside it quietly, thinking about everything he had discovered. He imagined the woman reading that letter for the first time, feeling the mix of love and sadness in every word. He imagined the soldier returning years later, heartbroken, burying the letter because it was the only way he could say goodbye. He thought about how strange it was that more than a century later, he had stumbled upon it. It made him realize how powerful memory could be, that even when time erases names and faces, love can still find a way to speak. As the night grew darker, he whispered softly, "You're not forgotten anymore." He didn't know why he felt so emotional. Maybe it was because he had seen so many graves before, all with their own untold stories, and this time, he had finally given one of them its voice back. When he got home, he wrote everything down in his notebook, every detail, every date, every clue he had found. He printed a copy of the letter's transcription and added it to the folder. Then he wrote a short note at the end. Love never really dies. It just waits for someone to remember. Over the next few days, word spread around town about the discovery. People who had never visited the old cemetery before began to go there, leaving flowers not only on that grave but on others nearby. The once forgotten corner of the cemetery slowly came back to life. Even school children came on field trips to learn about the story. The curator made a small plaque that told the tale of the woman who waited and the soldier who returned too late. The letter was framed under glass, its faded words preserved for everyone to see. One afternoon, as he stood in the museum looking at the letter on display, he noticed a couple standing nearby reading it quietly. The woman wiped her eyes and the man put an arm around her shoulders. He realized then that the story had done more than uncover the past. It had touched people's hearts. That night he visited the grave again. The moon was bright and the air was cool. Someone had left fresh white lilies by the stone. He smiled softly, feeling a quiet sense of peace. He knelt and touched the edge of the grave, whispering, "You're remembered now. Both of you." For a long moment he stood there, feeling the calm of the night settle around him. The story that had begun with a simple act of curiosity had turned into something far greater. An act of remembrance, of love rediscovered through time. As he walked away from the cemetery, he glanced back one last time. The lantern light flickered faintly near the stone, and for a brief second, it almost looked as though someone was standing there, two faint figures side by side. Watching the stars in silence, he smiled to himself. Maybe some stories don't end after all. Maybe they just wait until someone cares enough to listen. And now their story was no longer buried under dirt and time. It had finally found its voice again. Days turned into weeks, and the old cemetery began to change in ways no one had expected. The once quiet and lonely place had become a small spot of peace for the townspeople. People who had never cared much about history started visiting. Some came to leave flowers. Others came just to walk among the old stones, reading names that time had nearly erased. The man who had restored the forgotten grave visited often, not because he felt obligated, but because it had become a place where he could think clearly. Whenever life felt heavy, he would come and sit by that grave, watching the way the light shifted through the trees, how the leaves moved gently in the wind. It reminded him that everything in life, even what seems forgotten, still has meaning. One afternoon, as he arrived at the cemetery with a small bouquet of wildflowers, he noticed something new. There were fresh flowers already lying on the grave, simple daisies tied together with a faded blue ribbon. He looked around, but no one was there. He smiled softly. Maybe someone else had been touched by the story, too. He sat down on the bench nearby, taking a deep breath. The air smelled like rain and grass. He thought about how it had all started, with curiosity and a broken gravestone that no one cared about. Now that same grave had become a symbol of love, of memory, of how the past never truly disappears. As he sat there, an older man slowly walked up the path. He was holding a cane and moved carefully, as though every step needed thought. When he reached the grave, he looked at the stone for a long moment, his expression gentle. The younger man stood up, giving a polite nod. The old man smiled faintly and said, "You're the one who fixed this, aren't you?" He nodded, surprised. "Yes, I did." "You knew about it?" The old man chuckled softly. "Oh, everyone knows now. You brought life back to this place." He paused, looking down at the grave again. "My grandfather used to tell me about this story when I was a boy. Said his own father knew the woman who rests here. I never thought it was real until I saw the letter in the museum." The younger man listened quietly. The old man's eyes were soft with memory. "He told me that when the soldier came back, he couldn't find her. He came here one evening, buried something beside her grave, and never returned. I guess you found what he left behind." He nodded slowly. "I did, the letter." The old man gave a small smile. "Then maybe he can finally rest now, knowing someone remembered." They stood together in silence for a while, 2 generations connected by a story that had traveled across time. The wind rustled the trees and a few golden leaves drifted to the ground. After a moment, the old man turned to leave. "Thank you," he said softly. "You gave my family's story back to us." Those words stayed with him long after the man had gone. He hadn't realized the impact his small act had made, not just on himself but on others. What had started as a simple restoration had become something far greater. That evening, as he walked home, the town felt different. People smiled as he passed, and a few even stopped to ask about the grave, wanting to know more about the woman and the soldier. The story had spread beyond the town now. Local newspapers had written about it, and visitors had started coming from nearby places to see the restored grave and the letter in the museum. He never took credit for it. Whenever someone asked, he simply said, "It wasn't me. It was their story. I just happened to find it." Months went by and the seasons changed. The cemetery looked beautiful in every one of them. In spring, wildflowers covered the ground like a blanket. In summer, sunlight poured through the trees and touched the gravestone gently. In autumn, golden leaves framed it like a painting. Even in winter, when snow covered everything in silence, the grave still looked peaceful, never forgotten again. He continued visiting, always bringing something small. Flowers, a candle, sometimes just his thoughts. One winter afternoon, as he stood there brushing snow off the stone, he saw a family nearby reading some of the other old gravestones. A little girl pointed to the restored one and said, "That's the one from the story, right?" Her mother nodded, and they placed a small white rose beside it before walking away. He smiled, his breath visible in the cold air. It warmed him to see that the story had become something people cared about deeply. Later that day, he went to the museum again. The curator had added more to the exhibit: photographs of the restoration process, newspaper clippings, and even a small section of the letter's translation for easier reading. People stood quietly before the glass case, reading the words that had survived a century. He stood there too, looking at the letter one more time. It was strange how something so small could carry so much emotion. A single page of words had connected the past and the present, 2 people who never met, and a whole town that had almost forgotten its own history. As he left the museum, he walked past the river that ran through the town. The sun was setting, casting golden reflections across the water. He stopped for a while, leaning on the railing, thinking about how fragile life was and how quickly things could be forgotten. Yet somehow even the smallest acts, cleaning a gravestone, reading an old letter, telling a story, could keep something alive forever. One evening, a few weeks later, he received a letter in the mail. It was from the old man he had met at the cemetery. Inside was a short note and an old photograph. The note said,